mortar rounds exploding in the early morning darkness around them. Captain Roger Donlon and the Green Berets of A-Team 726 raced to their alert positions. Hundreds of Viet Cong were overrunning their camp, and a desperate fight to defend the inner perimeter was about to begin. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy through reference to primary sources. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. Please consider supporting this channel and its mission through Patreon. The link is in the description. The Nam Dong A-Team camp was positioned on a valley rise in the Trois Tien province. 5,000 people lived in 9 villages in the valley, which was 32 miles west of Da Nang. The camp was also 12 miles from the border with Laos, placing it on a major infiltration route from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Captain Roger Donlon led A-Team 726 7th Special Forces Group, which was training and advising 311 Katu tribesmen and a South Vietnamese Special Forces team. Warrant Officer Kevin Conway of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was attached to the Green Berets, and American anthropologist Gerald Hickey had arrived in July. Hickey was there to interview the Special Forces team, part of an assignment by the RAND Corporation, which was researching American military advisors. The Green Berets and their 60 Nung bodyguards were responsible for the defense of the camp's inner perimeter, while the outer perimeter was defended by the 311 Sid G of Strike Force 122, led by Camp Commander Captain Lig. On the night of Friday, July 3, 1964, Sergeant Michael Disser, leading a patrol in the valley, reported that the villagers were afraid but would not explain why. Then the following day, Sergeant Terry Terrin, returning from a 3-day patrol, brought news that 2 village chiefs had been murdered. Donlon briefed the team at 08:30 on July 5th and, suspecting an imminent attack, ordered increased vigilance. Sergeant Ray Whitsall then handed Hickey an AR-15 to help defend the camp. The first mortar round hit the mess hall at 02:26. Sergeant Keith Daniels was jolted out of his bed in the communications room, and as more mortar rounds exploded in the camp, accompanied now by volleys of bursting grenades and the rattle of small arms, he reported the situation to Da Nang and requested a FLARESHIP and airstrike. Hickey took his glasses, sneakers and AR-15 and ran to his alert position at the southwest inner perimeter. Sergeant Thomas L. Gregg stepped out of the dispensary with his shotgun. Spotting crouched figures moving through the glare of the burning mess hall and exploding mortar rounds, he raised the shotgun and fired, cutting down 6 Viet Cong at almost point-blank range. As Daniels bounded out of the communications room with his rifle and a belt of ammunition, a blast tossed him into the air. Finding himself uninjured, he continued to a defensive position. Staff Sergeant Merwin Woody Woods crawled out of his quarters in only his underwear and a pistol belt. Holding an AR-15, he ran through enemy fire to a position overlooking the helicopter pad. Sergeant First Class Furman R. Brown was racing to his 81mm mortar position near the dispensary when he saw grenades coming from the direction of the mortar pit. 2 Viet Cong grenadiers were hurling grenades from the top of the concrete bunker at its rear. A 57mm recoilless rifle round then blew a wall apart a few feet away, throwing Brown off his feet. Rising to his feet, he ran to the command post for grenades and found Donlon and Master Sergeant Gabriel Ralph Pop Alamo saving ammunition and equipment from the burning CP. Turning back to the mortar position, George Tuan, one of the interpreters, was hit a few yards ahead of him. He was struggling to sit up as Brown reached him, and having lost both legs below the knees, he was dead in 30 seconds. Brown was then thrown through the air a second time by an exploding mortar round as he ran back between the burning buildings. He then sprinted back to his mortar pit and jumped into the position. Looking up into the barrel of a submachine gun, he jumped onto the edge of the pit, shot the 2 VC on the ammunition bunker, then quickly put the mortar to work, firing illumination rounds that bathed the attackers in light. Sergeant First Class Vernon Beeson found his nungs breaking out ammunition at his mortar position, and he also began dropping illumination rounds into the mortar tube. Disser and Staff Sergeant Raymond Whitsell, the team's engineers, climbed through the window of the supply room where they slept. the room receiving a direct hit as the men hurried to their mortar pits. Witzel hurried down the concrete steps and began to drop the 18 illumination rounds into the 60mm mortar tube that he had laid out previously. When Disser reached his pit, he found 6 Nungs firing their carbines towards the main ammunition bunkers, and looking over the edge of the pit, he saw hundreds of VC moving through the camp. The first wave had overrun Strike Force 122 and the outer perimeter, and now the main assault force, 2 reinforced VC battalions numbering 800 to 900 men, were less than 30 yards from the inner perimeter. Disser began to fire into the attackers. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Conway pitch headlong down the mortar pit steps. Shot between the eyes, he was unconscious, and moaning with each shallow breath. Alamo was at the front of the pit, burned from the collapsing CP, and was picking off VC at close range with his AR-15. A few minutes later, Lieutenant J. Olniak arrived at the mortar pit. He removed his jacket and placed it under Conway's head, comforting the Australian until he died, half an hour after he had been shot. Alamo was firing at figures among the ammunition bunkers 33 yards away, while Disser was uncasing and firing illumination rounds. Olejniak joined Alamo and began firing grenades towards the ammunition bunkers, holding his M79 launcher almost vertically. Donlon was now attempting to organise the defence. Spotting movement at the front gate, he ordered Disser to provide illumination. As the first round popped over 3 VC within the inner perimeter, Donlon dropped 2 with half a dozen rounds, and as the third began to crawl into the grass, Donlon stopped him with a grenade. Donlon's forearm was bleeding, and he had a small shrapnel wound in his stomach. The Nungs were continuing to hand Brown 81mm rounds in his mortar pit. One after the other, he pulled the increment charges from the tail assembly, removed the safety clip, set the timing, and then dropped the round into the tube. A dead VC was hanging on the inner perimeter wire 10 feet away, and muzzle flashes and shouts 30 yards away indicated that the Viet Cong were massing. At least 100 VC were lit up by an illumination round, a group of around 15 rushing towards the fence. Daniels fired his AR-15 into them, Greg's shotgun booming as he and 2 Nungs joined him. The defender stopped the first wave, but more followed. One of the Nungs shouted a warning, turning towards the bunker at the rear of the pit. He fired 3 carbine bursts at the top of the bunker, and a VC, a dynamite grenade in his hand, fell backwards. Donlon was working his way towards the rear of the camp, calling for a medic. Responding to a shout from Greg, he jumped into Brown's pit with Smiley carrying the hand radio. He asked Daniels if he had contacted Zanang, concerned that support had not arrived after almost an hour. Donlon decided to return to Disser's position near the front gate. As he and Smiley passed the supply room, the ammunition exploded, knocking him to the ground. His leg torn by shrapnel, Donlon and Smiley continued to Disser's pit. The attackers were now within grenade range, and volleys were being tossed into the inner perimeter. A fragmentation grenade exploded at Olniak's feet. Realising the bones in his feet were broken, he tightened his bootlaces and tied them around his ankles. Another grenade tumbled into the mortar pit, wounding Disser. He continued to fire his mortar until a second grenade bounced into the bunker, landing in an ammunition box beside him. The explosion wounded Disser a second time, but he crawled back to the tube and again dropped rounds into the mortar. Grenades continued to explode in the mortar pit, the men heaving them back before they could explode. But Disser realised the situation in the pit was hopeless, and covered by Donlon, Disser and Smiley withdrew to a shallow ditch, followed by Olejniak and the Nungs. Donlon was starting to help the wounded Alamo to his feet when a mortar round exploded at the top of the steps. He regained consciousness half in and half out of the pit, bloody and in great pain. Alamo sprawled dead in the pit below him. Donlon picked up the 60mm mortar and moved back 30 yards to a pile of cinder blocks. There he tended to 4 wounded Nungs, tearing his t-shirts into bandages. Propped against the cinder blocks, carbines in their hands, Donlon left the mortar with them and ran to Staff Sergeant Merwin Woody Wood's pit. The youngest member of the team, Sergeant John L. Houston, short of ammunition, was mortally wounded after holding his position for over 2 hours. The fire from the Viet Cong began to slacken as the FLARESHIP arrived overhead at 4 AM, and within minutes they started to withdraw. An excited, high-pitched voice suddenly flooded the camp from a loudspeaker in front of Brown's mortar pit, demanding their surrender. Brown adjusted the elevation on his mortar and quickly fired 10 rounds of high explosive and white phosphorus. Firing resumed all around the perimeter, and when the loudspeaker resumed its broadcast, Brown again smothered the area with rounds, this time silencing it. The fire continued to slacken, and the Battle of Nam Dong was over. Donlon would be presented with the Medal of Honor by President Johnson on December 5, 1964, in the presence of the surviving members of A-Team 726. Alamo and Houston posthumously received the Distinguished Service Cross, while Olezniak, Brown, Disser and Terrin were awarded the Silver Star, and Beeson, Daniels, Gregg, Witzel and Woods the Bronze Star with V for Valour. Warrant Officer Kevin Conway was the first Australian soldier to die in Vietnam.